Good morning, everyone. The data center building boom. It has become a top of mind issue for communities across the country. And we've been covering this closely at WP Intelligence, particularly what it means for power demand and the electric grid. But today, we're going to examine another interesting aspect of this build out boom, the impact it has on how America builds. It's a construction boom that has reached $40 billion just last year and is expected to grow rapidly. I'm Louisa Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, and our mission here is to help decision makers see around corners of policy and industry trends. Every week at these briefings, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors to help us go quick and deep. Our subscribers also receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and technology, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare. We have a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and newsletters. But today we're going to examine an aspect of the building boom that has had less attention than electricity, and that is the impact on building materials, particularly the cement and steel industries. Why are these important? It's because traditionally they've had a big carbon footprint that's been hard to reduce. But today we're going to talk about some recent developments in how that's changing and why. We're also going to talk about some new changes on the energy side, specifically a tug-of-war between the state and federal governments about who should govern the electric grid. It's getting very interesting out there in the building boom. So to help us make sense of these newest developments and their long-term impacts, we have an expert panel. Kathryn Clay is our lead energy analyst, and she's published a report recently on the conflict in the energy sector, and she's also been covering the impact on energy materials. And she's joining us today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she's been teaching a class on energy, environment, and climate at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Kathryn, and thanks for making time to join us this morning.
Great, thank you. It's nice to be with you.
And Brian Schmidt is Senior Director of Economic Policy and Analytics at the American Cement Association, and he joins us from Chicago. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
And Jim Little has 3 decades of hands-on experience in the construction and materials industry. And as Director of Technical Sales for the National Ready Mixed Concrete Company, he's responsible for the company's innovation and sustainability efforts. And he joins us from Ontario, California. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
All right, so here's how we'll organize this very big conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about what the building boom has meant for the US construction industry overall, and then we'll focus on cement and the impacts of the data center build out on the US steel industry. And then we'll shift to talking about how the AI data center impact on energy could have long-term consequences for how the US electrical grid is governed. And I'd like to thank our audience for all the questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing, and we've used them to shape this conversation. And throughout the hour, I invite you to please drop your questions and comments into the Q&A, and we will take relevant questions as we go along. So with that, let's dive in. Kathryn, the aspect of the data center build out that has received the most national and political attention has been the demand it's creating for power generation and the strain that it's putting on grid infrastructure. And we've done several briefings with you on this, and we'll talk about some of that a little later in the hour. But what's fascinating and what has received less attention, and something you've shone a light on, is the way this massive build out is impacting the construction industry itself, and particularly construction materials. And you wrote this fascinating report for us recently entitled AI's Expansion is Forcing Steel and Cement to Decarbonize. So maybe start just by explaining some of the decarbonization goals of the tech companies that are building the data centers and why they're impactful.
Absolutely, Louisa. And you're spot on when you say that this is a topic that has not gotten a lot of attention. We're talking so much about the climate impacts because of the increased energy usage and the unprecedented demand growth on the grid caused by data centers. And it's likely that it's exactly this kind of criticism that has motivated big tech to make a real priority about green construction materials. And so, somewhat behind the scenes, and it's a bit surprising that we haven't heard them make more public announcements about this. It's certainly included in their sustainability reports and their annual reports, but there hasn't been a lot of public discussion about the green specifications and the low carbon standards that tech is putting into place that is driving markets for cement and steel. We're really in the middle of a green revolution for building materials that has been accelerated or really spawned by data centers on their own volition. And it's a good news story in the middle of a larger context discussion about data centers and climate change.
That is fascinating. And we have an audience question, Kathryn, on this point, asking how can data centers become carbon negative? Has any corporation attempted to take on that challenge? And given the vast amount of capital going into the data management sector, it would make sense that the data centers invest in long-term sustainability. Can you just give us a sense of what the ambitions are that the tech companies are trying to bring forward as they build these data centers?
So the specific goal of being carbon neutral, I have not seen in any of the sustainability reports or any of the goals set out in annual reports from the tech companies. I think technologically it might be achievable. It's not going to happen tomorrow. We had another audience question that I'll kind of jump ahead to a little bit, which is taking an example from Europe. In Germany, there is a program that they call the Blue Angel program. Little confusing here because the Blue Angels are something else. They're the show flight for the Navy. But in Germany, Blue Angel is a term that they're using for data centers that meet certain requirements. I believe it's 100% renewable energy, some other factors on that. And one of the requirements that isn't occurring in the United States is that if you are placing a data center near a community or some kind of a campus, that the waste heat from the data center, because we know that these computer chips generate a lot of heat, that's why they require so much liquid, so much cooling, and that requires energy. So the German program requires that all that waste heat be used for what's called district heating. So basically, that waste heat is just piped into local buildings. District heating is a lot more common in Europe than it is here. So I think that's a tougher challenge for us. And without it, I'm not sure that we can, to be frank, get to net zero. But we can certainly get that carbon profile down quite a bit. And it's going to require not just renewable energy, but paying attention to the embedded carbon, the carbon that goes into the materials themselves. And that's why what we're talking about today is so important.
Got it. So, Brian, can you give us a sense of the scale of the data center construction boom and put it into context for us and just give us a sense of how it looks from where you sit in the construction industry?
Yeah, so the growth that we've seen in data center construction, it's really unprecedented in modern American construction. And the closest parallels would be the housing boom in the early to mid 2000s and the recent industrial construction cycle that we've seen in building out semiconductor manufacturing plants. But for context, single family construction starts rose about 39% over a 3-year period before peaking. Inflation adjusted industrial construction spending grew about 124% over a 3-year period. And in data center construction, we've seen real construction spending grow 218% over the past 3 years. And unlike these previous growth periods in other markets, there's still room for expansion in data centers. In 2024, the world consumed about 150 zettabytes, which is the equivalent of 1 trillion gigabytes of data. Now, for comparison, in 2010, it only consumed 2 zettabytes. So the need for these data centers really began to ramp up in 2017 with cloud computing. And data centers are categorized in the office construction category. And you've seen really since work from home has taken off from the pandemic, that means less demand for traditional office space. But ironically, it actually has increased the need for data centers themselves. And then what we've seen in 2022 when AI models like ChatGPT really came online, it really meant exponential growth in data center construction. So there's a lot of upside for this type of construction for years to come. And this really translates to, as was alluded to previously, is that tech companies are really a growing contingent of important purchasers of building materials. And these tech companies have carbon neutrality goals of their own, so they require these green cement and steels in these really hyperscale projects. And this is the potential to reshape the marketplace. So at the same time as we've seen this data center boom, we've seen a huge increase in lower carbon blended cements in the U.S. And blended cements went from around 4% of the total market beginning in 2023 to now 2/3 of the market today. So there's been widespread of adoption of these cements sort of alongside this data center boom. And because these blended cements are such a new product, we've seen more widespread adoption in the marketplace. Now all 50 state DOTs accept them in public use, but engineers and contractors tend to be a little bit more cautious of these new materials. But given that these data centers are so high profile, such a large undertaking, I think that will go a long way in sort of shaping perceptions in the construction realm going forward.
Right. Brian, we were just showing a minute ago, maybe we could go back to it, a data center construction growth chart that you brought with you. Can we talk about that one for a moment?
Yeah, so like I'd mentioned, the census categorizes data centers in the traditional office space. And what we've really seen is a tale of two different markets. Traditional offices have really been in decline due to structural forces related to work from home, where at the same time as data centers have really taken off due to demand for AI. And like I'd mentioned too, it's a little ironic because as people have gone and worked from home, you do need these sort of offline data centers to house the cloud.
Oh, that's fascinating. So for a moment, just talk about, given these numbers, given these growth trajectories that don't seem to be slowing down, what kind of market power is that giving the data center builders?
It's really shifted the market power to a lot of these tech companies or the developers that are undertaking these data center projects, because we've seen a lot of widespread weakness in some of the traditional commercial markets. We see obviously offices, which I just touched on, but also you see in retail and some of these other markets that have really been hampered by high vacancy rates. So you really do see a shift of importance to these data centers and sort of away from some of the traditional markets of the past 20 years.
Great. Well, Kathryn, let's start with one input into data centers, and that is concrete and cement. You wrote in your report that this is quite important, what's happening in this industry, because it's one of those industries considered, quote, hard to abate. Explain what that means and why is it so hard to abate?
Absolutely. So, first of all, steel and cement, which is what I focused the report on, together account for about 15% of global carbon emissions. So, we're talking about huge industries here with a lot of impact on our climate. And both of them are considered hard to abate in climate policy parlance because it's not just about the energy inputs to making cement or making steel, but it's actually intrinsic to the material itself, or I should say to the traditional ways of making the material itself. So what you see in that graph is, and welcome people to look on the report online, there's a component called clinker, and that is a very small component of the volume. Yeah, that's great. So you can see there exactly right. That clinker in that dark red is a very small part of the volume, but it is a very large contributor, a very outsized contributor to the total emissions of the cement production. And what is clinker? So clinker is made from limestone, from heating limestone, and I'll defer to our experts to give us a little more color. But the problem is that there's a chemical reaction that occurs to make limestone into clinker that by itself generates a great deal of carbon dioxide. So even if you were able to run a cement manufacturing plant completely on renewable energy, you would still have significant carbon emissions just because of the chemistry of the traditional way that we make cement. And so what's really exciting is that the data center boom, because of these specs, is creating market pull and giving good reason for cement manufacturers to invest in alternatives to clinker or blends that use less clinker. And that is the way forward to reducing emissions from this very important sector.
That's fascinating. So, Jim, you're in the middle of all this. Talk about how cement makers are adapting to these requests from the tech companies, and how are they finding ways to reduce the carbon of these inputs?
Sure. So there's definitely an increase in the demand for lower embodied carbon construction materials like cement and concrete. What we have to realize is that cement is not a what I would call a building material in the traditional sense of the term, because we don't use that cement by itself. As Kathryn explained, it's used to make concrete, which incidentally is most the most highly consumed material on the planet, second to only water. So it makes it the number one consumed man-made material on Earth. And when you look at the sheer scale, that adds to the importance of that carbon reduction or that embodied carbon reduction. And we achieve that by blended cements. Blended cements have lower clinker content, which, as accurately described by Kathryn, when the production of cement occurs, about 60% of the emissions produced is from that chemical process. So there's not a lot we can do there. There's alternative technologies that exist in the very, very early stages. We consume a lot of cement and concrete in our country. It's literally the foundation, right? It builds the infrastructure, the roads, the schools, the highways, and the data centers. But when we look at reducing the emissions, we can do that by reducing the clinker content in the cement, and that's done through blended cements. Codes and standards permit the use, and as was mentioned earlier, the construction industry is slow to change and slow to adopt, but we've seen a huge increase in recent years.
So you're getting this big demand signal from the tech industry, which, as we've seen, is going through this huge growth spurt. Tell us, like, what does that look like on the ground at your company? What does that spark? How do companies like yours respond when that demand signal comes in, sort of on a concrete level?
Sure. So with ordinary Portland cement, just a few short years ago, as Brian showed, the graphic is in an upward trend for the demand for these products. So just a few short years ago, we were producing ordinary Portland cement. That was the cement of choice, and for some parts of the country, it still is. At our company, we've made that switch. In just a few short years, we've gone from ordinary Portland cement to a blended Portland limestone cement that has about a 10% reduction beyond ordinary Portland cement. Now, there's other things we can do. We talked about the energy. We need the energy. We talked about the raw materials. We need the raw materials. But fuel sourcing and fuel switching to alternative fuels is really helping us drive down those emissions even further.
That's great. Well, Kathryn, in your report, you found that there are still some significant barriers to the adoption of these blended low carbon or lower carbon cements. Can you talk about what those look like?
Absolutely. And Jim just alluded to the issue, which is codes and standards for buildings. And it really, at the heart of it, is because of the way our system works. We have a lot of local decision makers. We let decision making flow down to the community level when it comes to setting building codes and standards. And while there are some directives that they need to comply with from the state level or the federal level, building codes and standards really are set by local officials. And so if you think of how many local jurisdictions we have around the country, you see the scale of the problem. If those local authorities are accustomed to writing in Portland cement into their building codes, then one by one, we have to do the work of education and advocacy and helping them change those requirements to allow for these lower carbon blends. And, just like the construction industry professionals, you can imagine that folks that are responsible for building codes are going to be conservative because they're looking at buildings that they want to stand for perhaps 100 years. And they know Portland cement can do that because we've been using it for more than 100 years. So it takes the work of documenting through testing and demonstration and then educating local officials. But it's work that is important and that we could do.
Well, Jim, in your experience, are these low carbon blends as good, as reliable, as long lasting as the traditional Portland cement?
Absolutely. Blended cements have been around for decades, not necessarily here in the United States and certainly not here in California. However, they are becoming more popular because of the way they're blended, and with the materials that they're blended, they're just as strong, just as durable, just as resilient to chemical attack and able to withstand the environments in which we expose them to, whether it's a saltwater or corrosive environment or what have you. The cements perform extremely well, and in some cases even better than ordinary Portland cement with a lower embodied carbon. So, first and foremost, we need to maintain constructability. Projects have schedules. Contractors are accustomed to finishing ordinary Portland cement. Things get a little bit different. There is an education process that has to take place, and we're making progress on a daily basis. We see changes that have occurred in just the last couple of years where we wouldn't see a blended cement permitted or called for in the specifications. We've made those changes, and now we're starting to see it more and more. And the AI boom and the tech boom is certainly moving those demands along. So it's very encouraging to see, and we're excited to be a big part of it. Things are growing at a faster and faster pace. We're looking at other blended cements other than your traditional Portland limestone cement that have even a lower embodied carbon. So to see these changes take place, it's been very exciting, very encouraging. I say we've seen more changes in the last 5 years than we have in the previous 30.
Wow, that's pretty dramatic. We have a couple audience questions I want to throw to the panel. We've talked about the zoning and requirements at the local level, but we have an audience question maybe for you, Brian. Does the Trump administration support the use of low carbon building materials?
So, being a trade association at the national level that, produces a material that Americans use every day, we do try to work with every administration, every White House, infrastructure doesn't, have a political party necessarily. So right now we're working to align with certain, of the current administration's goals, one of which is to support producing more cement domestically. And that, to bolster cement production locally means that we can control the inputs in ways in which we can reduce our carbon emissions. And so we support the president's goal of creating more manufacturing jobs. And all our member companies also agree that the current permitting process is cumbersome, and there really needs to be a modernization of that process. And that really would go a long way in supporting the industry's decarbonization goals. And in terms of environmental efforts, each ACA member company is prioritizing efforts that fit their own plant right now, in investing in ways they deem appropriate. Kind of as Jim alluded to, it's not just blended cements alone. There's a myriad of other ways that we can reduce the carbon at the plant level, and these include alternative fuels, like Jim had mentioned, which are now up to 17% of the industry's fuel mix. There's also things like using decarbonated materials as a raw feedstock. So there's a lot of different ways throughout the value chain, even in concrete blends, using more SEMs, that kind of thing that can reduce the emissions of our industry.
We have a couple audience questions on international comparisons. Kathryn, there's an audience question asking, are there construction methods used under European Union standards that would reduce environmental impacts of US data center? You already talked about the German example. Are there any other things you would highlight there?
I think the German example might be the most relevant, but it is true that in Europe, they tend to, the tendency right now is for localities to have more say in whether data centers are going to be constructed. And part of that might just be because it's more densely populated and people are closer to the sites that are being put forward. I think there are some things that we could learn from Europe, but I actually think that Europe is really going to be learning from us. And a lot of it, when I say that, is because of this decarbonization or lowering the carbon content of building materials. My reporting is showing me that we're really ahead of Europe and that our American industry is doing very innovative things. And I think, if anything, when it comes to the building itself and the embedded carbon in the building, Europe is going to learn from America.
That's fascinating. We have another audience question that's come in. I've heard about weaved concrete and that climate-focused designers have traveled around the world to learn about more sustainable building materials. What is that and how does it relate to this conversation? Maybe for you, Jim.
Weaved concrete?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not certain I've heard of that. One of the big challenges that we face on new novel materials is that again, we use a lot of concrete throughout our country, obviously, and throughout the world. So the material availability is at a scale that a lot of people have a hard time imagining just how much material is consumed to make our infrastructure, to make our roadways, our hospitals, our schools, and our data centers. So to come up with a product that is low carbon, that is commercially available and viable, that can really make an impact is quite challenging. The levers we have to pull today to reduce that they're viable options, and blended cements is at first and foremost the easiest thing that as an industry we can do. And the more we blend with either calcine clays as we do with our limestone calcine clay cement that has a much lower embodied carbon impact on the concrete in which it's used. The more we can use materials at scale, the bigger impact we're going to have as an industry.
And you're talking about the incredible scale here. I don't know if this is a Jim or a Brian question, but one of our audience members asked, what percentage of total cement usage is projected to be related to data center building over the next few years?
It's data center construction is well over 2% of total construction spending, and it's a really it's a growing market, and it's over the next several years it's projected to be in the millions of tons, just for data centers alone in terms of market size.
And then we also have a question that I don't know if any of you can answer. Where is China in reducing carbon emissions since the largest construction in the world takes place there?
That I have not looked at, but I think that the questioner is very right to point out that there is an enormous amount of construction underway in China, as well as other emerging economies. And I think that what is likely to happen is the innovations are likely to be developed in the Western economies, the more advanced economies first, and then as costs come down, they'll be adopted overseas. But having said that, I have not looked specifically at China, and I know China in other ways is very aggressive in climate goals. So something for me to look into. So thank you for the question.
Excellent. We have another audience question, maybe for you, Jim. Please discuss the methodology for measuring embodied emissions. Do they vary by jurisdiction, for example, US versus EU? Are there standards, and who are the potential standard setters?
Sure. So that's a great question. The embodied carbon in concrete and cement is measured by what we call an environmental product declaration. Think of that as you will as a nutrition label. So when you're looking at a food product, a box of cereal, a can of beans, whatever it may be, and what is most important to you? Is it fat? Is it calories? Is it cholesterol? Well, the environmental product declaration, or EPD, as we refer to it as, is essentially a nutrition label that has the environmental impacts of that product. For concrete, it's either in a cubic yard or a cubic meter. For cement, it's a metric ton. So when we look at those, the global warming potential is indicated in terms of CO2 equivalent. So you have all of the attributes kind of normalized to CO2. The lower the CO2 equivalent, the lower the embodied carbon. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. Well, another important area that you looked at, Kathryn, another important construction material is steel. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Talk about why is steel so hard to abate?
Right. So for very similar reasons as to making cement, it's not just about the energy inputs at the steel manufacturing facility, but it's also about the chemical processes that go into making steel out of iron ore. So coke that is derived from coal is a key component, not just for introducing energy content, but also for generating the carbon itself that helps in that chemical process of creating steel. So again, as long as you're relying on coke for that chemical process, you are going to have higher emissions, even if all the other electricity, all the other energy that you're supplying is renewable. And steel, of course, is, as I mentioned before, together, steel and concrete make up 15% of global emissions. So it's a very important sector for us to get our arms around if we're to address the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. And so what I assume that the focus on reducing the carbon footprint of construction by the data centers is sending a similar market signal to the steel industry. How is the industry responding then? Are they able to reduce their carbon footprint the way the cement makers are?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating issue. So steel is similar in that it is being driven by the specs for green construction materials that the data centers are putting in place. And I should say it's not just for the data centers themselves, but for all of the component suppliers. So for the fabs that are making the semiconductors that are used in the data centers, they're asking that those be using green construction materials as well. So it really is an amazing market driver. Now, the story with steel is a little different than cement because even before this data center boom, we were seeing a dramatic shift in the steelmaking industry towards what are called electric arc furnaces. So we'll see a graphic on that in just a moment. But the reason that the United States is able to transition to this electric arc technology is actually because we are a mature economy and we have a lot of steel scrap from recycling. So old buildings come down, we can recover the steel, cars are retired, machinery is retired. And so it's that process, because scrap metal is very accessible and plentiful in this country. We've seen actually over the last 25 years or so this steady transition from the more traditional coke-based furnace, the blast furnace technique, to electric arc furnaces. And so that story has been much longer underway, kind of happening, I think, a bit slowly in the background. And it's something that we, as a mature economy, are able to do that not every country can, because we have this ample, every year replenished supply of scrap material.
And that is so fascinating, Kathryn. Is this something that the U.S. industry can turn into a competitive advantage in the global marketplace? As you point out, we have a lot of scrap because we have a lot of old things falling apart because we started industrializing earlier.
Absolutely. And it's really fascinating. One of the things that I learned in my reporting is that even though Europe, their economies are even older than ours, but they do not recover. They don't have the same mechanisms, the same infrastructure for collecting scrap that have evolved in the United States. And so there's every reason why Europe could be using more electric arc furnaces and getting those carbon advantages, but they're significantly, probably a decade or two behind us in making that transition. Now, other countries like India or China or Africa, the developing world, they really would have to import scrap to be able to use electric arc furnaces. And that's the other element that's going to be interesting, is that you're actually starting to see a little bit of what they call scrap nationalism emerging, where countries such as Indonesia have said, we're not going to allow the export of our scrap metal because we want to be able to keep it here and transition to more energy efficient mechanisms for steel manufacturing ourselves.
Scrap nationalism. I learned the most fascinating things from you. Um, there's an audience question asking, how are U.S. steel factories keeping up with the pace? And is this something we can expect to create a stronger steel industry in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you look at that graph, I mean, the numbers are very clear that the industry is very committed to the transition to electric arc furnaces. And, make no mistake, that trend line is going to continue downward. So as these blast furnaces, these more traditional furnaces that reach the end of life, they're going to be replaced with electric arc furnaces. Now, it won't go completely to zero because, as the experts explained to me, there are certain kinds of specialty steel applications where you have to start with what they call virgin steel. So steel that has not been sourced from recycled materials, that has been reprocessed. So it won't go completely to zero in terms of the older technology, but absolutely, this is something that the U.S. is becoming a world leader in. And we can certainly benefit from exporting the technology, maybe through licensing agreements. Our companies could show a leadership role. But certainly, we really are, we're showing the world how to make steel less carbon intensive.
We have an audience question that just came in, maybe for you, Brian. What can U.S. policymakers do to help promote the adoption of greener data center construction techniques? Would this be largely dependent on local governments to promote greener construction policies, or are there things that can be done at the federal level to promote green reforms?
I think it's probably a mixture of both, but I think probably the largest lever would be permitting reform and procurement policies that could really open the door for sort of some of the other non-blended cement levers that we discussed. I think alternative fuels is a large one. I think also having an ample supply of decarbonated raw materials like fly ash. I think some of those policy levers, kind of a combination of the state and federal level, likely more so the federal level would go a long way in helping to continue to green the AI boom.
Kathryn, in your report, you had some recommendations for business leaders flowing from your reporting. Do you want to share a few of those, and then we'll invite the rest of the panel to weigh in?
Right. Well, I think that, first of all, anyone who is in the construction industry is probably aware of the changes that are taking place. But one of the things that I recommend, and this goes back to our earlier discussion, is communicate with your local zoning authorities and educate them on these new products, these new greener alternatives, and help us make the transition by opening up markets to these world-leading products that are coming onto the market. So I think that also, anyone who's in the construction industry has something that they can gain from being able to talk about using green materials and use that in your own marketing. I think there's some real possibilities there for a lot of businesses. And I think the awareness that data centers are using these greener materials and that it's really changing the market, even if maybe it's not quite where you need it for your applications, watch this space because things are happening very quickly, especially in cement. And if the product isn't there for you quite yet, talking to a provider, you may be able to get there sooner than you think.
Brian, I'd love for you to weigh in on that. And also, we just had an audience question come in. What kinds of permitting reform are most important for the cement and concrete industries?
I think that being able to access, being able to use certain types of alternative fuels in throughout many areas of the country. Right now, only certain cement plants are able to use certain fuels due to permitting restrictions. And there's also really the use of some of these decarbonated raw materials are being kind of constrained due to some procurement policies as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of recommendations for business leaders, what would you say?
In terms of the overall AI build or the
Sure. I mean, just to follow on to Kathryn's comments.
Yeah, and I think that there should be that they should be incentivized to further this AI boom because it really is kind of an international race between making progress in terms of the U.S. versus progress made by other countries. I think the gains of that will really be seen in the next several years.
Mm-hmm. And
If I
Jim,
could, Louisa,
wait,
just a follow on for Brian there. What are you seeing with states and highway construction? Are we making way for green materials in the highway industry?
Yeah, so now all 50 state DOTs now accept Type 1L cements, and those are kind of the blended cements that we had discussed, and that was really a kind of a long thing for ACA. It's a very important threshold for all 50 states to adopt because that could go along, and that's such a huge market for us. I mean, 30 to 40% of cement consumed is in highways and streets. So that's a really big, kind of silver bullet market for us. And I think there's a long way for that, especially with the adoption of the new infrastructure bill that we're expecting this fall.
Excellent. And Jim, any last sort of advice from you as someone who supplies many businesses?
Sure. I think Kathryn hit the nail on the head there. In engagement with your material supplier, we see specifications on a regular basis that do request because there are municipalities, here in the state of California that do have green building codes. We do have the California Green Building Code, and at certain times we can do even more substantial reductions than what codes or specifications called for. So as a material supplier, we each have our different abilities in terms of what materials we are using, what can be used at a concrete batch plant, and to really maximize those GWP reductions and minimize the embodied carbon in construction. You really have to have that engagement a total team collaboration with owner, architect, contractor, engineers. So there's certain things that we see in specifications that really hinder the reduction of embodied carbon from an engineering standpoint. And water cement ratio is one of those things, and not to go deep down that rabbit hole, but the engineering community is set in its ways, and rightfully so. We're conservative because we build the safest, strongest, most resilient buildings, and so we want to maintain that integrity. But if we engage with all of the stakeholders, that's going to maximize our benefit for embodied carbon reduction.
Well, that's a great note. Kathryn and I are going to continue talking about her second report, which is around governing the electrical grid and how that's changing. But first, I'd like to thank Brian and Jim for sharing all their insights and their experience. And I know we have a ton more audience question on cement, but I would encourage our audience to reach out to the Cement Association. I'm sure you can all provide a lot more background for those who want to go a lot deeper. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
very much.
Great. Well, Kathryn, let's turn to another impact that the data center boom is having, and that is around this question of who governs the electric grid. I mean, we've written a lot about the impacts of data centers on power demand and on various options for reducing that, but your newest report on this topic points out that governance has become an issue. So tell us about this issue at the center of your report.
Absolutely, Louisa. This is another kind of story behind the story, and it just goes to show that sometimes things that seem like the obvious and simple answer are a lot more complicated than that, and this is certainly one of those. So those that have been following the data center build-out debate over energy use and the concerns that adding all of these data centers will have affordability impacts. In other words, raising prices for residential and small business consumers of electricity. Behind that, there's a growing approach that suggests that, well, simply asking the data centers or requiring the data centers to bring their own generation, and BYOG, or pay for your own generation or contract with existing generation and claim it as your own. These kind of strategies have been put forward as the answer. And what I found in talking to experts and following the issue is that it's a lot more complicated than that. And I'll give a specific example that I talk about in the report, and that is the question of who governs the interconnection of data centers. Is it occurring at the transmission level or is it occurring at the distribution level? And there's a nuance even there. Traditionally, if you have a large power plant, a large electrical user connect in a state at the transmission level, traditionally our governance system would require that it's the state public utility commission that would govern the rates for that installation, even though it's on an interstate transmission line. What is occurring now is that the Trump administration, starting with the Department of Energy, encouraging the FERC, the federal regulator of transmission, has encouraged them to take over the siting and the interconnect queue decisions and require that these data centers bring their own generation. Now that sounds like that's great, that should solve the problem, except the costs that we all pay for in our electric bills are not simply the dollars per kilowatt hour, the cents per kilowatt hour from our usage. We're also paying system charges. We're paying for the cost of installation and maintenance of the wires and the transformers and the substations and the transmission lines. That's all distributed by our public utility commissions according to how they are able to assess the responsibility for each of those charges. So fundamental principle of rate setting is that those that use are those that pay. And so it's all about trying to find the fairest outcome. Now, traditionally, FERC handles transmission, bundles all those transmission costs together, and then just tells the state PUCs, this is how much transmission revenue you have to come up with from your ratepayers. And many decisions have gotten bundled together and are not visible to the states when that occurs. Normally, that's okay. That's been managed for many decades since the Power Act of 1935. But this is such a significant change. These data centers are such enormous users of energy. We're talking about users that are the size of a small city in some cases, that the public utility commissioners are communicating to the federal regulators, look, we are not able to assess fairly how to distribute these transmission costs, which are quite sizable now, to our rate base, and how much should go to industry, how much should go to commercial, how much should go to residential. We have to divide up that revenue burden in a way that's fair, and we need visibility to do that. So it's a great example of a well-intentioned policy that has much, much more complex implications, and we're going to have to work through those.
So Kathryn, in your report, you had a graphic showing the projected increase of large load interconnection requests coming out of this data center building boom. I just want to show that on screen for a moment. Just talk about the scale here.
Yeah, I chose, I could have chosen a number of any of the different regional transmission or state level transmission authorities. I went with Texas because, and so this graph is specific for ERCOT, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, because we predominantly are not talking about Texas as a big data center hub. We're primarily talking about PJM and Virginia, which is where the bulk of the growth is happening. But I wanted to make the point that this kind of conversation is going to happen everywhere. It's going to happen in every region of the country. And this graph shows that in, not an outlier, but just any representative region, this is the kind of growth that we're seeing across the country. These are the kind of requests for new data center requests for permission to connect to the grid. It's just staggering how big those numbers are and how much they are projected to grow.
And so you have the federal government saying we're going to make more of these decisions, and you have the state utilities saying, well, utility commissioners saying we need more visibility, you're not giving us enough information. Who is getting the upper hand in this tug of war, and where does it stand right now?
That is an excellent question. From my own handicapping, from what I have seen, I have to say I believe the federal government has the upper hand, and that's because the president is engaging so personally on the issue. We saw the president speak from the White House with technology companies talking about this concept of bringing their own generation to the grid, and them making pledges that they would bring their own generation to the grid. So anytime that you have a president that is so personally connected with an issue, it's very hard to back away from that in a policy perspective. So I think FERC has absolutely no incentive to not push ahead. They have absolute support from the very highest level. And I think that on the longer term, we might see a shift. I think that I was at a conference recently for the Electric Power Supply Association, and what I heard from some of the attendants there was, we can work with this, and this might actually be the right thing to do for the immediate term, but in the longer term, we're going to have to be much more methodical and figure out all of the implications.
And Kathryn, we had an audience question on this topic, and they were sort of asking about, okay, there's the federal government, there's the state utility commissions. What is the role here of local governments? I mean, we know there are a lot of local impacts.
Well, that's certainly true for siting data centers. The localities have a lot of say in whether those whether those data centers are able to be permitted. And it's a good point that if you are requiring them to bring along and co-locate their own power, that goes into local siting authorities as well. That brings up another point that I alluded to a moment ago, which is some of these data centers are they're testing the limits of what it means to bring your own generation. So, for example, saying, well, we're not going to have that generation at our site, but we are going to sign a contract with a plant that maybe it was a nuclear plant that had been retired or was going to retire. And we're going to provide a contract so that that power is quote unquote ours. So that will have implications for the locality that is not anywhere near the data center, but maybe is near that power plant that they expected would be retiring. So absolutely, there are always, whenever you're doing construction, local governments, local authorities have a good deal of say.
Mm. And just one last question on this point. In your report, you made this really interesting observation that it can be difficult for some of these state utility commissions to really know what kind of demand is headed their way
Mhm.
because there's a nuance in the data. Not all the planned or requested data centers will necessarily be built because some of the companies are making multiple requests in multiple jurisdictions. Can you just explain that for 1 minute?
It's a great element to bring out, Louisa. So what's happening is that the data center, hyperscaler data center developers are doing their due diligence. They're deciding where to place data centers. And because energy inputs and electricity costs are a big factor in that decision, they're essentially putting proposals out. It's almost like putting an RFP out to different jurisdictions and seeing, first of all, what's the interconnect time that jurisdiction, each of these jurisdictions would give me, and what kind of rate structure would they give me? In other words, what would be my cost per kilowatt hour? How would that be structured? And then getting that business intelligence, they then make a decision. So I want to be clear that there's nothing nefarious about this. This kind of thing would happen with any kind of large construction, whether you're siting a new manufacturing plant or a strip mall. This is absolutely something that you would do, is look at different jurisdictions. So it's not meant to be a pejorative, but I think that it is different and it is something we should be talking about. And the term that people are using is phantom data centers. And that refers to the practice of, well, if I put out 5 different proposals to 5 different public utility commissions, but I only intend on building one of those, what's happening is that all of those utility commissioners are trying to project what demand will be in their state, and they're all including that one center. And so we're getting duplicative counting throughout our electric grid system, and that's distorting our ability to make good decisions. So there is a need to have some kind of national database or information sharing between all of the states and FERC, so that we can make better decisions based on what is likely to actually be built.
That's absolutely fascinating and such an important point. This has been such a fascinating discussion, Kathryn, but in all our briefings, we always ask, what are you working on next?
Yes, well, in fact, I am working on this exact issue of the president's announcement of big tech bringing their own generation. And some of the other, we've talked about some of the implications in the tug of war between the PUCs and FERC, but there's some other implications that I'll be digging into and exploring. I'm also, of course, following very closely the developments in Iran and the impact on not just energy prices, but some of the other commodities. One topic that I think has a very important story, again, story that's not being told very much, is helium. Helium is a byproduct of production of natural gas. It occurs with natural gas in very, very, very small quantities. And so a lot of our natural gas actually comes from, and I mean globally, a lot of our helium comes from Qatar, which of course is a world power in natural gas. So helium is important for semiconductor manufacturing. It's important for healthcare applications like MRIs. And we know that we need to resolve the situation in Iran to be able to have a reliable supply. So I'll be looking at that as well.
Well, we really look forward to your reporting, as always, Kathryn. And we've had a lot of audience questions about this option of having data centers provide their own power. So we will keep those questions. We'll include them in a future briefing focused on that topic. And obviously an issue we continue to cover closely at WP Intelligence. I invite you to check out our platform. You can click on the link on your screen. For those who have asked about Kathryn's reports, we will include links for you to sample them when we send you an email with a video recording of this briefing. So thank you so much for joining us, and please take a moment to complete the short post-briefing survey that we send you. It really helps us know how to shape these briefings. And please join us next Friday for another briefing where I'll be speaking with our lead AI and tech analyst about how AI is transforming the huge industry that provides software as a service to big companies. You may have heard of the Wall Street SaaS apocalypse. We're going to unpack that and talk about the future of software as an industry. So have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next week.